Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Are You Listening podcast series from the table, updates on bargaining sessions. We have our regular host, Mish, back with us today. Mish, you want to say hi?
Hello, hello.
So we have a number of issues that we're covering in bargaining this week. So we have three different folks with us. Jim, Andres, and Paul, would you guys mind introducing yourselves?
I'll jump in first. My name's Paul O'Keefe. I'm full-time NTT faculty, Department of Geography, School of Arts and Sciences, Livingston campus in New Brunswick. Also a member of the Union Executive Council.
I'm Andrés Morera. I'm a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Molecular Biology and Biochemistry. I'm also the vice president of the postdoc union, the AAUP-AFT.
And I'm Jim Brown. I'm associate professor of English and on the Camden campus, director of the Digital Studies Center, and also president of the Camden chapter of the union.
Thank you so much. Could you all give us like a quick rundown first of just which issues we're bringing to the table?
I've been very glad to see up to this point that grad student issues in just about every bargaining session I've attended as an observer have been placed front and center. And the unfortunate part is that there's been very little concrete proposals in terms of progress, but we are very aware of the problems, and this is a real-time issue. It's the summer. There's international students who are unable to work and are frankly in crisis situations. So anyway, I hope to hear something about that.
Thank you so much, Paul. And Jim, you're introducing Article 8. Could you tell us a little bit about what that entails?
Sure. Yeah. In many ways, Article 8 is, in a lot of ways, is everyone's focus. It just sounds like another number, but it's the salary provisions, it's raises, it's that kind of thing. But in addition to being about annual raises and things like merit pay, there's a couple of really important equity provisions in that article too, about intercampus equity, about an equity salary process that's gone off the rails the last few years, and we'll be working towards helping fix that. And there's a cost of living adjustment piece to the article too. So that's the basics of Article 8. Being in Camden, my focus will be on a lot of those equity issues, but this hits both Camden and Newark. The typical faculty member in Camden makes something like 38% less than the typical faculty member in New Brunswick. And that number actually is specifically focused on the College of Arts and Sciences, because that's where the gap is starkest. When you focus in on the College of Arts and Sciences is where you really see the big gap. And the big start of that problem is at the beginning of someone's career, where in Camden, on average, you start out $30,000 less than faculty in New Brunswick. And then that gap persists across your career, because if and when you get tenure, your 10% raise is based on that lower number, right? So this is the major campus equity problem, which is an equity problem for not just the faculty members, but for students and for everyone at the university. We all work at Rutgers. We happen to be at a different campus. So that's a big part of what I'll be talking about. And then there's a cost of living adjustment argument to be made too. We all know inflation is a massive problem right now. And so in addition to making arguments for percentage raises in each year of the contract, we're making an argument for a cost of living adjustment that is attached to the consumer price index, meaning that if it hits a certain threshold, I won't go into the numbers, but all of that is available on the website. If the consumer price index is at a certain threshold, then in January of our contract year, there'll be an additional raise to keep up with inflation. And the big argument there is about competitiveness when it comes to recruiting faculty and students. So there are other pieces too. I should say one more thing about Article 8, which is the article also talks about minimum salaries for different ranks. And that's codified in the contract and always has been. And what that means is that, whatever that number is for an incoming, say, assistant professor, that's where the negotiations start in Camden. So let's say it's $65,000. That's the initial offer to an incoming faculty member in Camden. That is not the initial offer in New Brunswick. Those minimums are essentially ignored in New Brunswick, but they are the starting point in Camden and Newark. So the idea is to bring those minimums up across the board, and to bring them up a little bit each year. If those minimums stagnate over the course of the contract, that continues the problem of inequity.
Numbers strike me so incredibly. You're saying $30,000 a year is the gap when you start. I mean, if someone who has a 3-decade plus career at Camden, that's $1 million problem. That's a shortfall over their career. I hope we can all push across all campuses for it. As you talked about minimum salaries and the importance of them, I can't help but think of the postdocs, not just this issue of spatial justice, but also the postdocs which get left in this gap that, again, I hope Andrés will speak to more.
Yeah, Andrés, can you go ahead and jump in and tell us what you're bringing today?
Sure. If I could just speak real quick to the salary stuff with postdocs, it's like there's quite a discrepancy in how much a postdoc is paid, depending on department. And like, for example, pharmacy postdocs are paid a lot different than, postdoc that might be in, say, like anthropology or something. What's great about the proposed minimum doesn't matter what discipline we're in. And we should be paid, equal pay for equal work, at the very least. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. Okay. As for Article 30, so Article 30 covers bridge funding and research support. So the overall intention of this is helping cover an individual postdoc or graduate student or faculty member who is grant funded, who has an interruption in their grant stream. Like, for example, in my case, I actually am in a lab where my funding was interrupted because a grant was not renewed, and that grant happened to pay for my salary. And there I was left without a means of income. So, and then I had to be let go temporarily while we secured additional funding. So this is aimed to avoid that, because such an interruption in research and other work that postdocs do, it's lost time, it is lost money, and there's a lot associated with that. So I don't know if you want me to go into like my situation or for.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us what that's like.
So as I said before, I'm a postdoc in the Department of Molecular Biology and Biochemistry. I've been here for 3 years. I do laboratory research. I have to be in the lab to generate data, and data is what makes the world go round in my neck of the woods. So when COVID hit, there were several months when nobody was able to go into the lab at all. And then even after that, there was a prolonged period of physical distancing, which really reduced the amount of work we could do in the lab. And I mean, of course, these measures are completely justified given the pandemic, but it really hurt our ability to do work. And just in case people who are listening aren't familiar with how funding works for, let's say, a biological research laboratory, we are funded by grants. And these grants come from funding agencies such as the National Institutes of Health, or the National Science Foundation, et cetera. And you have to apply for them. You have to justify the feasibility and the usefulness of your research. And in order to do so, you often have to have preliminary data, substantial good data that shows like, hey, here's the foundation of my work, and here's the work that we're proposing to do, and how the data that I have so far fits into that. And then in addition to that, there are grants that need to be renewed. And during the renewal process, you're subjected to a review by the funding agency every year, or however long the period is that they do the review. And they look at how many publications you've produced. They look at what kind of data you produced. You have to submit a report to them. And if they don't deem that you've done enough with the money you were given, they're not going to renew your grant. So it's somewhat of a precarious position that we're in with being grant funded. And so with COVID hitting, our ability to publish was nil. I mean, we weren't able to produce nearly enough data to do publications. So when it came to review time for our grants, at least 2 of them did not get renewed.
Right.
And that left some of us on the chopping block, because the Department of Life Sciences were unwilling or unable to float the lab while we secured new funding and reapplied for another grant. And so I was let go because I did not have my own source of external funding. I was being funded through that R01 grant that the head of my lab, applied and got. And it wasn't just me who was let go. It was also 3 other people. And that left our lab as basically a skeleton crew for several months. And that further reduced our ability to produce data. It's a vicious cycle. If you let go of people, you don't have the means of getting the research done that will allow you to get more people, more data, get more grants, whatever. Fortunately for me, I was able to secure funding for myself pretty soon after. And we were able to secure funding really quickly. But still, even then, so the other three, we have to look for new people. They aren't coming back. Fortunately, none of them were international, because if any of them were international, if say I was an international postdoc, I would have been under threat of being deported, because, hey, the stipulation of my visa is that I'm employed. And
the same
so
issue that's facing some of our grads right now.
Exactly. I think this illustrates the need for bridge funding, because this is incredibly wasteful for the university to not have something like a bridge fund, right? I'm gonna, in my case, it's almost a best case scenario for what happens when you don't have bridge funding. You have to go through the proper channels for rehiring, which that takes time. In fact, I still don't have a solid reappointment date. Then on top of that, I'm going to have to restart my research. I work with living organisms. This is not something I can just be like, oh, I'm going to pick it up. Just open a saved document and there you go. No, I have to grow these suckers. I have to, feed them and whatever, make them happy. And on top of that, there's a lot of other things. I'm going to have that probationary period for 2 months, right? There's 60 days where you're not going to be put on health insurance. You're not going to get retirement. But yeah, I'm going to have to go through that again. And I've been here for 3 years, why do I have to go through that again? And I'm going to have to pay Cobra in the meantime.
Paul, you had the luck of being the observer this week. And I say that ironically because I was the observer last week and it made my blood boil. On the 12th, when I was the observer, there was still no clear commitment from the university to fund extensions for grads who received letters of non-appointment on April 31st of 2022, despite the repeated testimony from grads about the precarity that we continue to face as fall semester looms. Administration continued to kick the can down the road, so to speak, and argue that they needed to collect more data, despite the number of grads who have given testimony directly to administrators, despite the fact that we have crunched our own numbers and offered data analysis to them repeatedly over these bargaining sessions and even in the months prior to that. They continue to advocate for this case-by-case basis of handling grad need. And so I would love to hear from you, what happened this round at the bargaining table.
I'll do my best to match that fantastic description. And I don't know, it would have been great if I could just say, yeah, they agreed that they will be the backstop, right? Because to me, that's all they need to be, right? They need to be the backstop to maintain the excellence that they have, be it in, research and bridge funding, as we'll discuss later, be it in, what's the point of funding a graduate student for 5 years and abandoning them if they're a year out from graduation? What's the point in saying because this department had a very early qualifying exams process as opposed to a proposal once you'd basically done your field work, written your dissertation halfway, that some of these people got funding last year.
Right.
For once, this is this very much is a singular issue, right? Well, I hope the pandemic doesn't reoccur, but we are dealing with a single thing that occurred that threw every grad student's life upside down. So what do they have to offer? Well, from what I can gather, possibly that management is moving, dangling the promise of actual things, but not quite having the courage to say out loud what they have or haven't got on the table. I'm an optimist, so I always like to preface my analysis with that because I'd like to hope that this is edging incrementally towards progress. The problem is that it's so time sensitive, right? The very obvious examples of international students, which is, these are discussions that Rutgers Global management, these things, this should not have threatened people's visa status or their ability to earn a living in the summer semester, right? And and disappointingly, the management didn't really have any engagement with these questions. What they have is their favorite tactic is, oh, this is an issue for Rutgers Global, or oh, this is a chancellor level.
One of the things that came up that you just gestured towards was that so a member of our team came back and said, we've done more research, here are more numbers. Can you at the very least give us a guarantee around our international students because they are the most precarious? And I think we were repeatedly told that this was addressed in an email, and by addressed in an email, and that those students were being treated as if they were any other graduate student facing non-reappointment right now, and that they're still going to go through the process of trying to whittle down that list as much as they can before they give us any more information on what their plan is. That was my understanding.
I fully agree that that was not a solution to any of the really detailed questions and problems. Again, this is not that the grad students are not prepared. This is just, it's a waiting game when there's not time.
Yeah. We also put out a call last week, and I just want to reiterate for our listeners or anyone watching that if you're interested, if you are a grad facing this issue and you're interested in sharing a testimonial either with us here on this podcast, where we have a call-in number that you can record your testimonial. If you'd like to join us for a session, any of those things, please contact either this email, which is in the link for the podcast and the YouTube video, or find us on social media, because we'd really like to hear from you. Our university administration loves to tell us that they don't know what our grads are facing. So come tell them.
And just one other point that I, again, just would like to emphasize is the outstanding quality, I mean, on this podcast, but as well on the negotiating committee of the graduate student leaders in our union. It's, it's a privilege to work alongside and hopefully in solidarity always. And it's really good that, between us, we've managed to keep these issues at the front of every session. And that's, until it's resolved, it should be. But that doesn't mean other grad student issues go away, which we'll return to in the discussion on Article 8.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I just want to add, this whole kicking the can down the road and this waiting game of collecting data is part of the admin's tactic for essentially trying to starve out international grads who can't pay their rent, right? Because the more people who are, getting closer to that fall date and don't have funding, the more likely grads are to leave, right? Who's going to face starvation when they have the option of leaving the academy and getting a job in the service industry, getting a job in the nonprofit industry, doing whatever it is they need to pay their rent, right? And so knowing grads who have been in this position for the last 3 years, from my perspective, watching these admin look at us and tell us they still don't have enough data to ascertain how many of us are really in need right now is an infuriating tactic, right? Because then they can check these people off the list and say, well, they don't need funding because they're not enrolled in the university anymore, which must mean that they're fine, right? No, that's why we're getting closer and closer to this fall deadline with not a word from them, right? And so from what I remember at the last session, some of our members, I think, tried to respond to an admin with the demand for a timeline, right? Tell us when you will have enough data, because you keep pushing this and pushing this and pushing this, and we're telling you that real people need real answers like yesterday. And so I wonder, did that conversation come up again this bargaining round? What did they say this time in response to that?
My understanding is that maybe next week there'll be something concrete, but it goes back to this issue that might solve it for 5 or 6 people, because maybe, but all of these cases that the graduate students, all of the data that they've pulled together, I don't understand why management gets hung up on these things, which are financially beyond insignificant in the greater scheme of things. They are individuals. They're not recurring costs. They're just problems to fix that are probably less than the average med school, payoff to a, leaving faculties. I may have missed any fundamental intellectual objections that management brought to the arguments we're making. They've made arguments, they may come back with counters that say this is too high or too low, or this is, but they've not fundamentally said this is not happening. They very well may. But
It's been my understanding that their position is not to take a position on the philosophical.
It's the Boris Johnson School of Management. Just stagger on to the next weekly session. The last point I want to make, a lot of what we're trying to achieve in this article specifically is what's it mean to level up the most needy, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized within our beloved community.
I think that's actually a great point to transition to Jim and check in on how Article 8 discussions around cost of living increases and campus equity went.
The point you just made about the decision not to talk about the problem or talk about this philosophical issue, and not to say like, look, we all agree, we all see the problem. The only disagreement we have is like how we're going to solve it. They've never said that. And I think that's certainly a calculation. They've also never said that they'll often look for opportunities to put the responsibility somewhere else. Even in the discussion of Article 8, part of the demand is that when a retired faculty member dies, their partner who had health benefits because of their relationship to that faculty member loses those benefits, right? And actually this happened to a member of ours recently, which was one of the reasons it came to the surface for us as a union. And the idea was, look, we all agree that that's a bad thing. Like anyone can look at that and say, this shouldn't happen. So we would like to codify some process that makes sure that in the future, that would never happen. And the response was, wait, don't we just follow what the state benefits program does? So, the answer was essentially not, we recognize the problem, let's figure out together, let's work together to solve it. It was, I don't actually think this is a situation where we solve the problem. Someone else is supposed to solve it. There's no law or regulation against Rutgers solving the problem. It's almost never, look, we recognize that maybe this is a situation where someone else may step in and fix it, but we're going to fix it because it's the right thing to do. And they have failed to ever do that, in my experience, not even in a way to win some goodwill so that later they could say, oh, we did this thing over here. Like we're here to solve problems. That really just never happens. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out. There's a trend that you pointed to, and this looking for ways to push responsibility off, looking for ways to never grant that there's a problem, never say it out loud. And then the other trend that we mentioned that shows up in questions of equity, especially, is the case-by-case basis thing, because the solving problems on a case-by-case basis is excellent for management. They love to do that. It destroys solidarity. It works directly against everything we're trying to do. And so solving problems on a case-by-case basis is always what they want to do. Our current salary equity program is built on this logic already, which is, okay, you want salary equity? Put together a proposal, gather your own data about your own situation, show how much you're underpaid, treat this as an individual problem for you, submit that information to the university. We'll decide if we agree. We'll let you know if you get a salary adjustment.
And we'll hire a union besting law firm to review your case.
To review your cases and to send it to University Compensation Services, which is this entity that doesn't know anything about how academic work works, how academic salaries work. They develop a regression analysis that spits out a number. That number says you make less than this person that you're comparing yourself to. And it gives a number that says how much of that is explained and unexplained. Well, the explained amount is essentially saying like, you make 10,000 less than that person and you're supposed to. And the rest is unexplained. And that's the part we have to, we'll ostensibly pay you. But I did want to come back to that case-by-case basis piece, because the solutions we're proposing in Article 8 are the opposite of that. So for instance, part of the proposal is across the board raises for people in arts and sciences in Camden and Newark to address the gaps I talked about earlier, right? And in the past, when those sorts of proposals have been put forward, they have rejected them outright. That's how we got the equity process we have right now. So during the last contract negotiation, we pointed to this equity problem. We said an across the board raise for people in these situations would begin to address the problem. And what they say is, no, that's not precise enough. We need these sort of like surgical ways of deciding who actually needs equity. And then again, do it on a case-by-case basis. Now, So to go to what I presented and the response, I presented on the economic demand. I presented on campus equity. I talked about those meaningful minimums. I actually showed a clip of a student who did one of President Holloway's interviews, his Faces and Voices series, a Camden student who worked in the lab that I direct, and who's a really excellent advocate for the Camden campus. Unfortunately, she just graduated. And at the end of that interview, she was allowed to ask Holloway a question. And her question was, we all pay the same tuition at Rutgers, but when I look around at what Camden looks like, it doesn't look like what New Brunswick looks like. And I want to know how you're going to address that. And so he provided an answer about some needs on the level of infrastructure. He also talked about, the office of the president being this like largely symbolic or cultural office, about how like when he shows up to places, maybe it moves things in certain ways, which oftentimes feels like he's not highlighting the fact that like he's the decider.
Yes.
He holds the purse strings. He can solve some of these problems. And so I showed that clip as a way to highlight again that the president knows there's an equity problem across the board, not just at the level of faculty salaries, but at the level of everything: staff experience, student experience, just the everyday experience of life in Camden and Newark is radically different from what happens in New Brunswick. So I presented all of that, got 0 questions or responses. There was a caucus of about 20 minutes. They came out of that caucus and asked, I think, 3 questions. And then we've gone to bridge funding. So what the pattern to this point has been: detailed proposals with detailed presentations, with stories that people want to tell, that explain these proposals are not coming out of nowhere. Like there's a reason for them. There's data to back them. I cited the salary data that we talked about earlier. And then the response is basically nothing until perhaps we'll get an email that is a kind of marked up version of the article. But even that has been fairly lacking, and we haven't seen very much response at all.
When they did come back with questions, Jim, what were those questions? Those questions were not specifically to you.
They were not to me. So for instance, there was a question for Sarah DeGeorgis, one of the grad workers who was presenting, about bringing grads up to a living wage, right? And the question was, which calculator are you using to determine what the living wage is? So those are the kinds of questions we normally get. It's really, again, it's not like, well, of course everyone should have a living wage. Like, hey, let's settle on the calculator we're going to use. Like, we all agree we need a calculator. Which one are we going to use? That's not what happened.
I've actually been asked that question, I think maybe 2 or 3 times at this point in bargaining, and the answer is always the same. We use, for anyone who's listening, who's interested, we use the MIT calculator, which is a region-specific cost of living calculation. And the amount that was put forward by Sarah DeGeorgis is lower for grad students than the surrounding universities have recently raised their grad funds to.
Oh yeah, those are the questions. And I think a similar question to the cost of living adjustment. They tend to be very technical questions, right? And very, what I would consider to be superficial questions, and not substantive. And also, again, never saying, look, we agree that this is a problem. Let's hammer out a way to solve the problem. It's a lot of silence. And then, nope, keep going. On to the next proposal. So that's really how it felt. Like I expected maybe some questions about the meaningful minimums, like salary minimums, because that's a relatively drastic change to the contract. There's an entirely new table inserted into the contract that says here's what those new numbers would be, and here's how they would go up each year. The only question they had was this table isn't currently in the contract, right? Oh, okay. I see that it's new. So those are the kinds of questions we got. I really didn't have to do any. I talked for 10 minutes and that was it.
And you presented really comprehensively, and it was great to see you representing Camden, placing, again, I'm a geographer, I'm biased, but this sense of spatial justice, it's very much part of this broader article, which is, leveling up everyone. I would hope, based on the management team being part of the last cycle, a lot of this contract language is, adjusted versions of that contract in terms of when pay rises are and whether they're lump sums or whether they are merit-based or just a across the board. And again, those discussions weren't really in any depth engaged with in the bargaining session last night, which again, we hope at some point, I assume we'll get some version of a counter to these articles. I was trying to just think about the article a little more, and I guess a lot of other people as well as me, I'm materialistic as most. What we actually propose in, we've talked about the cost of living, but I think when you get into the guts of the article, we're looking at a flat rate increase for full-time faculty. That principle that faculty across the board get paid a single lump sum, which is proportionally much more impactful the lower your starting salary is, again, contributes not just to the whole faculty body, but specifically addresses those that are underpaid and helps level up places like Camden and Newark.
It's true. I mean, in year one of the contract, it's a flat rate that everyone gets is $6,573. That's based on what it would cost to give everyone a 5% raise, and then take that number and divide it equally. And as you said, people who make the least will get the biggest bump from that. And in the last contract, when the first year was that flat amount, multiple people in Camden came up to me and said, like, this is the biggest raise I have ever got.
That was my experience. I'll say Rutgers Union's also won me. I didn't realize, when I first got employed here, they paid me a lump sum for the summer weeks. And that was, I learned, and eventually that's why I got so involved with the union. But there's these stories, and I'm just so much more amazed when it is grad students and postdocs who are leading it, because there's things faculty won 10 years ago that we're only now beginning to see the real benefits of, and what that actually means in terms of, you might actually be able to build a life in New Jersey, with or other bits. Anyway.
Right. No, I mean, you're right to point out that the grads and postdocs, again, and like everyone should remember this every single time we talk about this union, the grads and postdocs doing the fighting that they're doing will not see the fruits of that labor. Like it's very unlikely unless they're like year one in their program. And that tends to not be the person who's the activist in the union. The people who are fighting the hardest in this union are fighting literally for other people 5, 6, 7 years down the road. Right. And I mean, that's something we should just remind our members of constantly, because it's like, that's true solidarity. Like, that is how it's supposed to work. And it's something I repeat to people as often as I can.
I mean, I will push back just a little bit, and that sometimes the things that we do get, I mean, they do impact us immediately. Like, for example, the last contract bargaining that we did, for the last contract, we actually did get a substantial increase in the minimum salary, went from like $42K to $50. And people saw that, and it was retroactive. So, I mean, not everything agree with you overall.
Yeah. I'm thinking of people like Alex who was on, I think, on the last, right? Who's like outgoing, right? Like, graduating, like, and still fighting her ass off at the table.
Yeah, showed phenomenal leadership in reducing, again.
Amen. Honestly, and I mean, I think the grad students, like, they're just, wow, they're something to aspire to. Like, they're great.
Love it. I love that you guys are gassing us up today. I feel great about myself. Thank you.
No, I mean, I'm working as a member organizer for the postdoc union, and I mean, I want to model. I want to do my part to help us model after how you all run things. Also the PTLs too. But I also wanted to follow up on like what can be done. Things that graduate students, undergrads, postdocs, whoever, anybody who's listening wants to get, like, contact the union and see what you can do to get more involved. The union is its members, right? And the members are the ones who strategize and call the shots. And I mean, let's strategize on what to do too. I mean, like, it doesn't just have to be at the bargaining table and putting pressure. There's ways to put pressure and turn the screws outside of the table. And the more and of course, to do so though, it's best if it's done in an organized fashion and not completely ad hoc. Not that I'm completely against like wildcat actions, but you know what I mean? I mean, there's effective ways of doing things.
I think that's just a really good point just to mention in, an idea that helps drive me in my participation in what we're doing. It's not, there's the grad students over here, the postdocs over here, currently the PTLs. I mean, there are still some structural barriers, but every effort collectively has tended to be towards integration. We've seen graduate student leadership at the top of the entire faculty union and grad student union, and the counselors and the postdocs and everyone, all the staff across the 3 campuses. And, in some ways, I think it's really just worth mentioning. Again, I am a bit of an optimist, but this process across the summer where there has been a movement in unity, it hasn't always been smooth, but at some point management has to realize that different units are all working towards the same goals, and they may again put process-based issues why we can't go together. But, when we're trying to think of PTL and their reluctance to, fully acknowledge that their units voted to join in with our bargaining unit, all of these other issues that are, going on that are core to just our bargaining units negotiation sessions, but also the resolution of everyone's contracts, hopefully across Rutgers at the same time. Again, to me, as someone who's looking for hope, looking for positive changes, it's been really good to see the bits I've seen, how people have tried in a very contradictory world where sometimes real demands do contradict, trying to work through them in good faith, and then taking that collective strength towards the bargaining table and directing it towards the people we need to make change their minds. But I'd really like to hear Andrés' debrief about an absolutely stellar laying out of, again, something I wasn't that familiar with before the negotiation sessions last night, but something that's absolutely fundamental to postdocs, to other workers, to graduate workers, but also some of our most distinguished research professors at Rutgers. And it was amazing. I mean, what I took from it, as you laid out this kind of story of the human impact of the Rutgers machine spitting out, just damage unnecessarily, is you had something before COVID, a bunch of labs with PIs and postdocs doing brilliant, world-class, cutting-edge research. And presumably Rutgers wants that afterwards, so it wants to keep that going. And the way you told it reminded me of, this kind of logistics, commodity chain crisis we've seen around the world as we've come out of the pandemic. I was thinking of the semiconductors and the car industry, and all of a sudden no cars can be built in all of these places because there's this one thing. And in this case, all this world-class research can't continue or pick up and go. And the one thing, Rutgers, it doesn't often actually even need to fundamentally spend the money to never get back. Anyway, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah.
That was my take of, again, a really important article that you were speaking to.
Yeah.
Give us the 411 on bridge funding, please.
Sure. So bridge funding. So actually, I just want to give a shout out to 2 faculty that spoke before me. They were both research. They were professors. They run their own labs, and they were from different departments, and they gave their rationale for it, which ultimately aligns with my rationale as well. And then I came on to give testimony as to why we need bridge funding. And I didn't see much of any sort of response. I tried to temper the emotional appeal here with very concrete, solid rationale. But at the end of the day, something that I did, emphasize was that this is bad for the university because there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of money lost for the university because half of the grant money that we bring in, us individual postdocs and graduate students and labs as a whole, half of that, around that much, give or take, goes straight to the university. They take a chunk of that, and it's not just for operational costs. No, it goes to central funds, it goes to the departments, it goes to whatever central admin wants to do with it. And on top of that, too, it affects the prestige and reputation of Rutgers as well. And I even went on to say, I'm pretty sure most of us here who are listening to this have heard of the concept of the RU screw, right? I heard it before even coming to Rutgers, all right? And I let them know that, the reputation of this university precedes itself. And I was cautioned to consider carefully accepting employment here as a postdoc. So if they want to have a good reputation and attract the best and the brightest and stuff like that, they need to take good care of their labs, And they spend how many millions on athletics for reputation? Because let's face it, doesn't make money. It's even been admitted, right? Hey, the lab research and stuff like that, that's very much part of Rutgers' legacy and reputation and can attract students and employees and good faculty. And this isn't even that costly. Like the other thing that was covered, so there was the rationale given, and then there was this nuts and bolts and specifics that was given by another wonderful faculty member. Went into the nuts and bolts of the article. It talks about, okay, so how does this bridge fund, how does it get paid into? How is it dispersed? What are the technicalities involved? Like at least as a starting point, like how this would work. And it's very well thought out. And I just want to emphasize too that everything that we're proposing here, the university absolutely can afford, and it would not really impact the university negatively in a financial sense, if that's what they care about. In most situations where we're going to need bridge funding, we're talking about floating people for only a few months, if that. So it's not like it's going to be, billions of dollars. Like it's completely doable. And in terms of what Rutgers management's response to all this was, really, we didn't get much.
We brought together distinguished professors, tenured professors, postdocs to speak about, the issues at the cutting edge of research. There's been a huge amount of work put in, whether it's on the idea of fractional appointments in relation to bridging NTTs and PTLs, whether it's about the bridging funds that were discussed in this article that are about, continuity of research, but very much reputation as well, which as an R1 it needs, whether it's about equity for teaching or delivering or researching the same types of material across different campuses. We presented arguments. We saw video for Article 8, which was just fabulous. The articles all hang together so well. There's been so much work put in by the bargaining committee, by those who did the survey, by
the members.
By the members. It's these material demands. They're not unreasonable. They emerge out of our lived and experience, our work experience at our different spaces of work. And because they hang together, because of how we work, because of our supervisors, it is a coherent argument. And all the university has is to drag it out or try and pick people off. But within our union, I think we're on the right path. Just, how much, again, coming back to that question, how much do we need to escalate? How much do we need to demonstrate the power we have, make a visible show of it in order to get management to at least, begin to engage faithfully? Because we can't say they're ready to meet our demands. They're dismissing them.
If you're considering joining, or if you're a member and you want to get more involved, like, this is what we need help deciding on, right? Like, this is what we need help, making decisions about. Do we need to escalate? And if so, what are we doing? What are we doing at the bargaining table? What are we doing outside the bargaining table? Because it's diversity of strategies that are needed here to put pressure. And
what are you prepared to do to help us meet these collective demands? Because there's lots of work to be done. So, we all have every day, to have to get up and want to do this. But I think not just the potential outcomes, but there's value in this whole process as well, trying to work through it openly. We're now really just working through in real time. What does this mean? It's not just about Article 8, right? That's important. The material basis of our life for grad students, for faculty of all stripes, for all others. But I don't know, it's about this. It's about even being able to glimpse the future. This union gives me hope and has done in the past. And that's what I get out of sitting through these sessions and hearing some of our members, like what needs to be done, but also what can be done when we work together.
Yeah, thank you all for your updates at the bargaining table. And just, I guess maybe as a last comment from me, just building off of what Paul said so beautifully. I think a part of what bureaucracy does is to say that we are the ones who get to control your fate at this university. We get to control your working conditions, and we have that right because we have all of the money, because we've taken all of the money. And I just appreciate the reminder that we are the only ones who get to determine our working conditions, and that's why we have to fight. Nobody can tell us what is fair except for us, because we are the only ones who pay our own rent and who take care of our families and are in an intellectual community and a working community with each other. So
thank you all so much, Paul. I really appreciate what you just said, and especially about this being a process that we're all doing together in real time. I'm just so grateful that you could all join us today and tell us your experiences. And we hope that you'll come back, as these articles will inevitably come back up again on the table. And we hope our listeners will continue to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mish. Thanks, Danielle. This was great.
For doing this.
Really.
well, I think that wraps up this session of Are You Listening? Thanks so much for being here.
Listeners, please check out the links for getting involved. Thanks.
Thank you.